Welcome to the Planning for Life podcast with certified financial planner professional Russell Jacobs and financial life advisor Carl Coolidge. Carl and Russell will share creative strategies and ideas for overcoming challenges in your personal and financial life. Inevitably, life happens, and we will empower you to reach your destination. Thanks for joining us. Now, on to the show.
Hello and welcome to another Planning for Life podcast. Today I am talking to Russell Jacobs, and we're going to talk about divorce. Divorce is one of those things that you really should talk to a financial services professional before you start going to things like mediation, moderation, or getting an attorney, because there are a lot of financial ramifications here. But what you need to know about divorce has more to do with non-financial situations than the financial situations. We're going to cover both on today's podcast. So Russell, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matt. Happy to be here.
Well, let's talk about one of the biggest issues. So we are going to talk about the financial ramifications, but since you do have a lot of divorce clients, I'd like for you to sprinkle in maybe some stories or some of the emotional and the psychosocial aspects of divorce when it comes to these major topics that I want to cover today. And the first one is dividing property. In your experience, what have you seen with dividing property in divorce?
Well, you see all kinds of different things. Sometimes people are very agreeable over most things, but then end up in a very contentious divorce over something that you or I might think are piddly or insignificant assets. But just because something is financially insignificant doesn't mean it's emotionally insignificant. And I think both sides need to have representation in a divorce just to make sure that they're well represented. But it's very important, just like with planning, to know what you want from the divorce, but also more importantly, what you need, particularly if there are children involved. Because a lot of times it gets so emotionally fraught, stressful that people just want to get it over with, and they make decisions that they later regret. Yes, we've seen some incredibly interesting, in a bad way, scenarios. There was a ex-husband who agreed to pay alimony forever, and the ex-wife got in another relationship, but didn't marry because she was getting this benefit. And you just have to be careful what you sign, thinking that it's so bad you just want to get out of it. And the only thing that will make it worse is to get out of it and then have signed a bad divorce decree that just makes it worse. And then you get reminded of it every time you're either receiving a payment that's less than you should have gotten, or if you're paying more than you feel you should have paid, or if it's about the kids or the dog or whatever. So, but the one that sticks out the most was that one where the person ended up paying forever. Because once you sign these things, they become contract effectively, and
right.
You can try and get out of it by going back to court, but that's more time, money, and emotional distress as well. And there's no guarantee you're going to win.
And I know that states have different laws when it comes to all of this. So not everything is standard across the board. When it comes to the states that you work in, because you work in a lot of different states, is there some commonality when it comes to dividing property? Is it generally a straight down the middle split, or what has your experience been?
That depends. There are states, which like California, I forget, Nevada, there's several, I think there's 7 to 9 states that are community property states. And that's as you described it, with the exception of the assets that you brought to the marriage. But generally speaking, if you have definitive proof that you brought assets to the marriage, in many cases you cannot have that get tied up and having to get split. But assets that were created during the marriage will generally be split, not necessarily down the middle. There may be reasons that one asset goes to one person, another asset goes to the other. And then certainly tax impacts are important as well. And if you have, like a lot of people do, their largest asset is their home and their 401k plan, if you end up getting part of your husband or wife's 401k, there's a thing called a quadro, qualified domestic relations order. So you become the IRA owner. It's a rollover, direct rollover to an IRA in your name. But then any dollars you take out of that are going to be taxable. And of course, if you take them out before 59 and a half, you're subject to a 10% penalty. So you've got to make sure you can get sustenance financially from other places than just the qualified plan, if possible. And those are called non-qualified assets. But there is one methodology, not to get too much in the weeds, called Rule 72T, where you can actually access an IRA without penalty. But if you're younger than, say, 50, it's typically not very advantageous. So, just so there's a lot of facts and things. You just got to think through it logically, and it's such an emotionally dynamic time. It's sometimes hard to step back and do so, and that's where we can really be an added value to the client, male or female. We work with a lot of different people who've gone through this experience, and it's just challenging no matter how you slice it up, especially when children are involved. But you can get through it and survive if you do it, understanding what you want and need, and working through it as a manageable task instead of an emotional roller coaster.
And that's one of the big benefits that we've talked about in the past on the podcast when it comes to other financial specific matters, and including retirement, that it's really nice to have that objective third person. Let's move to debt. Okay, so you kind of highlighted a couple of the sections that we're going to dive a little bit more deeply, and we're going to talk about debt, we're going to talk about taxes, and we're also going to talk about retirement plans a little bit deeper. But let's talk about debt. What is the best? Let's just talk real high level. How does one figure out how to divide debt?
Well, just like with the planning that we do, a lot of this is going to be fact pattern based. In the old days, you typically had a husband making most of the money and the wife being just kind of relying on that. And so getting the home and the monthly payments, both for alimony and child support, was critical. But now in today's environment, and rightly so, I might add, having a 23-year-old daughter, you have women much more able to pull their own weight in this economy. So you have the inverse happening, where sometimes there's parity in income, sometimes the woman actually makes more. You just have to look at the fact pattern, and if you again can kind of divorce, no pun intended, the emotion from the situation and look at it factually, you try and want to look at what's fair, and sometimes that's difficult if there's been affairs involved, or financial, or substance abuse. There's just so many different things that can cause this. But to get a good result, you have to kind of look at it from the helicopter, where you're above the fray, so to speak, so that you can try and make logical decisions. But understanding the income stream, how it's going to be taxed, how long it's going to be paid, what are the ramifications if it's not paid, and because getting the agreement to pay and then actually getting the payment is not, one doesn't always follow the other. Who's going to have custody? Is it joint custody? Is it visitation rights? All these things have to be sorted through. And just talking through it, you can see why it's such an emotional roller coaster. But really, it's about coming back to you and understanding post-divorce, what do you have to maintain your standard of living? And how much of that other person's assets and income stream is rightfully yours. And it's not really about trying to prove a point and win per se. It's about fairness and equality and looking at the next phase of life that's best for you, that person, and your children. And sometimes we have to have that conversation. We're not lawyers, we're not psychiatrists, and yet we end up in the role of counselor in many cases. But if you have been married to someone for a long time and you forewent a lucrative career opportunity to invest your life in that marriage, you are entitled to fair compensation, whether it's a splitting of assets or income or whatever the fact pattern dictates. and you do need to stick to your guns and make sure that your legal representation knows what they're doing.
Have you been personally pulled into court with any of this stuff as a person's financial services professional to either testify or to provide information or expert analysis?
No, we don't testify in court. We have on several occasions done pre-work, working with the client and their representation to help provide the supporting information that they need. Just like if you think about it, when you're doing a financial plan to determine how much in the way of assets and income are you going to need in retirement based on your expenses, well, you have to do that prior to divorce as well. And that's another thing to think about. If you're thinking about doing this, if you can, and I'm not talking about a clandestine operation, but if you can quietly interact with a planner who can help you do the math on what are you going to need, that's very helpful because it gives you financial grounding as you're making these decisions. Because, it's cart before the horse if you accept an agreement when you haven't really done the math to see if it's actually sustainable. So, know what your budget needs to be. And I don't mean living on a budget. I mean your cash flow requirement to meet your basic living expenses and this type of thing, and be realistic. If you've been living in a 5,000 square foot house, but you may need a 2,500 square foot house, you got to look at what does that cost. So it's really about the fact pattern. It's really still just financial planning, just with a one person household instead of two, and how do you divide that up fairly?
I'm assuming that you pull in a lot of experts, including a tax expert here. What are some of the things that you've noticed from a tax perspective that our listeners should know about when it comes to divorce?
Well, you can end up where one person owns the debt and the other person owns the asset. That can be very frustrating. I think the one thing I mentioned earlier is if you don't have a lot of what we call non-qualified assets, which means non-IRA, non-401k, non-profit sharing plan, then you end up having all your assets in this one category. And I guess it's relatively okay if you're getting non-qualified assets, but if you're owning just qualified assets, you're going to be paying a lot of taxes down the road. And don't get me wrong, it's better to have it than not, but that's painful. You can. It's important to know that if you're married a certain length of time, we have a client who was married for 26 years until he wasn't, and his ex-wife is getting almost half his pension from his 20 plus years in the service. And, and he's comfortable with that because they raised children together and all of that. So I think one of the key things too is not even, I guess it's important to do the things we said, but it's also important to make sure you know where all the assets are and what the income production is. And, if there are rental properties, what's the income flow from those? It's about, I think it was Ronald Reagan that said, trust but verify. I think it's important to not be naive. And so believe what your spouse is telling you, but, understand the details as well. That's one thing that's always surprising to me is that people don't really understand what they have. And then they have to try and find out what they have in a contentious situation where that other person's not necessarily going to just give it to them freely.
How can you find that out, though? I mean, I think that's a very interesting point there. How does one find out where the assets are? How does one find out what their debt liabilities are and how many credit cards the significant other has? Do you have any guidance on that?
Well, I think it starts by having regular conversation with your spouse and, discussing, what's where. Now, if there's basic malfeasance where someone's just lying to you from the get-go, it's not necessarily true that you're going to get good facts. But, as people begin to go through the process, documents are expected to be turned in that list out all your assets. And are they marital assets, meaning they were gained during the time of marriage, or did you bring them to the marriage? And there's part of this discovery and disclosure process that is where most of that information comes from. But in a sense, to me, that's a bit too late at that point in time. If you don't really know, you should know where everything is beforehand. And you really do that by just being engaged in the relationship and understanding where things are, especially if you're the one who chose to stay home, man or woman these days, and you're completely relying on that income stream. And part of that might be maybe you're the one who pays the bills or takes responsibility for the household. Money is one of the biggest reasons people get divorced, because they don't talk about it. Or, I've seen people they're mad at their spouse, and so they go buy stuff just to get back at them. That just makes them madder, and I'm talking thousands of dollars, furniture, trips, jewelry, all kinds of different things. And all that does is make it worse. So I think it's about effective communication, frequently and often and in a balanced manner, because whoever the other person is, the other one's going to shut down or attack back if you do it in an inappropriate fashion. So, and that's not always easy. Sometimes we do, and it's not mediation as in a legal sense, but sometimes we do have those conversations with the couple.
If you're sitting down as a listener and your significant other is saying that you do not need to go with them to a financial planning or a meeting with a financial advisor, please stand your ground. It's vitally important to make sure that you know what's going on, as Russell's talking about. And on top of that, if you are in those meetings and there seems to be things that are not being shared, make sure that you step up and have those conversations. But more importantly, if you're not included in those conversations, then you should probably try to find another financial services professional, because you should be involved. You and your significant other are vitally important to make big picture financial decisions. And for those of you who haven't heard these statistics, 70% of women will be solely responsible for their finances at one point in their life. And in 90% of them, the last interview, was just a few years ago, said that they weren't actually prepared to handle their finances because they were either not educated, they were not communicated to, and they didn't know what was there. So last but not least, let's talk about Social Security and other retirement. Are you able, because of some of the decisions that were made, like you said, they forewent a career in order to stay home, either the husband or the wife in that situation. How are retirement assets and Social Security assets split when there's a divorce?
Retirement assets, again, they go through the calculation phase, and then they determine if it's a 401k or an IRA. That's where the qualified domestic relations order comes in. Or the pension. And then if it's an IRA or a 401k, it's going to be carved up, meaning the IRA or the 401k into an agreed upon split. And then whoever's 401k it is will still have a 401k. It'll just be reduced. And then the quadro, qualified domestic relations order amount, will be direct transferred into an IRA in the name of the recipient of the IRA. And then they just have an IRA that they can name the beneficiary of, et cetera. With the pension, in that example I mentioned earlier, you're going to be designated a share of that pension when it becomes payable. And then that communication going forward, they'll of course have to receive the documentation and all that, wherever it is, whether it's government or private sector. And then you're going to be the one receiving that pension at whatever time in the future it's payable. That's true also with non-qualified assets. In some corporate settings, there's stock options, things called 409A plans, non-qualified plans, and the soon-to-be ex-spouse can be entitled to receive a portion of that as well. So, you just need to understand. I think that brings up understand the benefits of your spouse's, soon-to-be ex-spouse's employer, so you can see and understand what kind of benefits they have. And you can make sure they're going to have to provide health insurance for you and your children for some period of time or until retirement or what have you. So understanding the benefits is a critical amount. With Social Security, if you were married 10 years or longer, then you're entitled to draw upon that ex-spouse's benefit. And, there's calculations for that. We actually use a software called Social Security Explorer, and we input the fact pattern, and it gives us excellent feedback along with a kind of a step-by-step instruction sheet of what you need to do to actually file this. So, and there are people that know they could receive ex-spouse Social Security benefits. We've actually gotten some people to turn those on at times after they found out that they could do so. And, some people get married a lot. I heard a story. There was a man who'd been married 3 or 4 times, and so he had 3 different people drawing on his record. And they're all getting the same amount, and it doesn't reduce his, which may be one reason Social Security has issues. But, it goes back to knowing the facts and knowing what you need, and I like what you said. It's about not being afraid to ask tough questions or make sure you protect your interest, and make sure that you get enough so that your kids are getting enough, and you're not having to kind of, crawl back to the table, if you will, to beg for more because you didn't do a good job to start with. But no matter how you slice it, it's not an easy situation to deal with, emotionally or financially. And then there's the, feelings like you're a failure that you have to deal with after the fact. And all these things can lead you to make financial mistakes. So just be careful post-divorce with the financial decisions you make too, and make sure you're working with someone who you can be sure has your best interest at heart.
And you have a pretty substantial amount of experience in doing this. And your kind of final words here, if somebody is in the unfortunate situation of needing to get a divorce from their significant other, any final words of advice that you'd like to pass on to our listeners?
Well, what comes to mind is know what you need and know what your family has, so that you know from where are you working, what is your foundational element of need and what assets are there to work with, both income assets, meaning spousal earnings, income producing assets, what is the debt. It's really about knowing the facts, and that should be doable if you plan. Divorces don't tend to happen overnight. They're things that develop over time. So you shouldn't ever live every day like you're going to get divorced, but you shouldn't live every day like you're not going to either. And so you need to know the facts and know what you need, and then protect your interest. And then I'd say make sure your CPA, your attorney, and your planner have your best interest at heart, because I have seen where it seems like the advisors like to keep the divorce going because they're making fees all along. And that's frustrating and expensive.
Well, Russell, thank you very much for your advice today when it comes to somebody and what they need to pay attention to if divorce is on the horizon.
You're welcome. Glad to be with you.
Make sure that you are fully prepared, and in no way, shape, or form does this podcast provide any sort of tax or direct legal advice. It's just the opportunity to understand what sort of questions you should be asking your financial services professional and your trusted advisors in your network. Divorce is not easy. It generally is one of the more difficult things, top 5 difficult things that people have to go through in their lives. But if you plan ahead, if you have good communication ahead of time, and if you're working with a true financial planner who is going to have those fact patterns, have those pieces of information that help you create a truly comprehensive financial plan, you will be in the light, not in the dark. So for everybody at Jacobs, Coolidge & Company, this is Matt Halloran, and we'll see you on the other side of the mic very soon.
The content is developed from sources believed to be providing accurate information. The information in this material is not intended as tax or legal advice. Please consult legal or tax professionals for specific information regarding your individual situation. The opinions expressed and material provided are for general information and should not be considered a solicitation for the purchase or sale of any security. Russell C. Jacobs III, Carl B. Coolidge, James Jacobs, and William Schwartz are registered representatives of and offer securities, investment advisory, and financial planning services through MML Investor Services, LLC, member SIPC, Supervisory Office, Jacksonville, Florida. Jacobs, Coolidge & Company, LLC is not a subsidiary or affiliate of MML Investor Services, LLC, or its affiliated companies.